It really feels like the conversation around who votes for which party is constantly changing, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. The old assumptions, they just don't seem to hold up like they used to.
Exactly. And today we're going to really dig into why that might be happening. Have you noticed shifts maybe in your own community about who seems to be aligning with who?
It's definitely something people are talking about, and we've got some great material to help us unpack it today. There's this really interesting Washington Post piece focusing on the Republican Party and its emphasis on civility.
Ah, okay. Civility. That's a word we hear a lot.
We do. And to ground that discussion, we're also pulling in some hard numbers from the Pew Research Center. They've tracked voter demographics and party coalitions all the way from 1996 up to 2023. So quite a long view.
Perfect. So our mission today for everyone listening is to see how these two things connect. We want to explore how the actual faces, the demographics of both Republican and Democratic voters have changed over, nearly 30 years.
Right, and maybe explore why those shifts might be happening, using the ideas from both the WAPO piece and the Pew data.
Understanding that should give us all a much clearer picture of where things stand politically right now, and maybe even where they're headed.
Thankfully.
So let's start with that Washington Post article, this idea of the GOP focusing on civility. What's the main argument the author is putting forward there?
Well, the author, Liliana Mason, her central point is basically that the Democratic Party, over time, has gained more, let's say, practical experience in building and holding together a really broad coalition. We're talking diverse racial groups, religious groups, cultural backgrounds.
A real mix.
A real mix.
Yeah.
And because their base is just inherently more varied, they've sort of had to figure out how to find common ground, between groups that might not always see eye to eye on everything.
Okay, so it's like a muscle they've had to develop. This coalition building across diverse groups, born out of necessity because of who makes up their base. The classic big tent idea.
Exactly. It forces a certain kind of negotiation and compromise, internally at least.
So how does the article contrast that experience with the Republican Party's approach?
It suggests that the Republican Party hasn't necessarily faced the same level of internal diversity within its core base, historically speaking. So they haven't had perhaps the same intensity of practice in navigating those specific kinds of cross-group dynamics.
And this is where the Pew data comes in handy, to see if that historical difference in diversity holds up.
Precisely. The Pew numbers are really illuminating here. I mean, look, the Republican Party has become more diverse since 1996. That's clear. The share of white voters dropped from 93% down to 79% today.
Okay, that's a significant drop, nearly 15 points.
It is. But compare that to the Democrats. Their share of white voters went from 77% in 96 down to 56% today. That's a much bigger shift.
Wow, yeah, so 79% versus 56% white voters currently. That paints a pretty different picture of the two parties' core compositions, even with the changes.
It really does. And the WAPO article sort of uses this difference to explore why the GOP might be emphasizing civility right now.
Right. So what's the proposed connection? How does having a less diverse base, even if it's diversifying, lead to a focus on civility? What's the thinking there?
Well, the implication, or one interpretation anyway, is that if your base is more homogenous, maybe your strategic focus shifts.
Yeah.
It becomes less about juggling the distinct, sometimes competing interests of many different identity groups.
And more about what?
And maybe more about emphasizing shared values or a common cultural understanding, or perhaps a return to what's perceived as common ground. Civility in that context could be framed as a tool.
A tool for what? Bridging gaps?
Yeah, perhaps bridging ideological divides within that more homogenous base, or maybe appealing to a broader electorate without needing the same deep, complex coalition-building toolkit owned by dealing with lots of different identity groups for decades.
So it's like saying, look, let's all just agree to be respectful, find this baseline, and maybe that helps create unity, potentially sidestepping some harder negotiations between groups.
That's one way to read the dynamic, yeah. It's
Yeah.
potential interpretation of the strategic choice.
Okay, that's a fascinating frame. So the Democrats, having navigated that more diverse big tent for longer, have arguably just had more reps, more practice in the messy but essential work of knitting together disparate groups.
Yeah, it's the argument. And you see that reflected in the Pew data on the Democratic side, too, quite dramatically.
How so?
Well, look at the growth within the Democratic coalition. The share of Hispanic voters, for instance, has basically tripled since 1996, going from 5% to about 16%.
Tripled, okay.
And Asian voters also saw a significant jump from less than 1% to around 6%. The black voter shares remained pretty stable, around 18%, which is a large and crucial part of their base.
So that sustained growth in Hispanic and Asian representation, alongside a stable, large black voter share and a declining white share, that inherently forces the party to engage with a much wider set of issues and perspectives.
Absolutely. It shapes their platform, their messaging, everything. It's baked into their reality, you could say.
So it seems like they've been managing this diverse coalition, actively building and maintaining it for a good while, whereas the Republican Party, while diversifying, is perhaps facing a different set of strategic questions because their starting point and rate of change are different.
That seems to be the core idea explored in the Post article, yes. Different histories, different coalition makeups, likely leading to different strategic priorities, and, well, different ways of talking about politics, like emphasizing civility.
Does the article talk about potential pros and cons of these different paths, strengths or weaknesses?
It doesn't explicitly list them out like a scorecard, but you can definitely infer some possibilities. For the Democrats, managing that diverse coalition, it's complex, right? You risk internal friction balancing all those interests.
Sure, lots of different voices to satisfy.
But the flip side is that experience might make them more adaptable, more resilient, as the country itself keeps getting more diverse. That bridge building skill could be a huge asset long term.
Okay, and for the Republicans, the focus on civility.
Well, it might be an effective way to maintain cohesion within their current base as they figure out how to navigate a changing America. It could appeal to certain swing voters too, perhaps.
But the potential downside?
The risk, maybe, is that it could be seen by some as avoiding the tougher conversations about the specific needs or grievances of different demographic groups, both within their party and in the broader electorate. Is civility enough, or does it sometimes mask deeper issues? That's the question it raises.
That makes sense. It's a complex calculation. Now, what about other factors Pew looked at, like age and education? Do those complicate this picture?
Oh, absolutely. They add more layers. Take age. Pew shows the electorate overall is older now than in '96, but there's a stark party difference. About two-thirds of Republicans are 50 or older, compared to just over half of Democrats.
And Democrats have more young voters.
Significantly more. About 16% of Democrats are under 30 versus only 8% of Republicans. So how does a message of civility land differently with the 25-year-old versus a 65-year-old? It probably does.
Good point. And education.
That's another big one. The electorate overall is way more educated. The share with a bachelor's degree or more nearly doubled since '96, from 24% to 40%.
Wow. Both parties seeing that.
Both. But again, different trajectories. Democrats saw a huge jump this year with a college degree doubled, from 22% to 45%. Republicans also became more educated, but less dramatically. They're now roughly split into thirds. No college, some college, bachelor's degree plus.
But wait, isn't the white working class, voters without a degree, still a huge block for the GOP?
Absolutely. White voters without a college degree are still the single largest demographic group for Republicans, making up about half their voters, 51%. For Democrats, there's no single dominant race education group like that. Their largest is white voters with a college degree, but that's only 30%.
So the internal educational dynamics are quite different too. Democrats are more reliant on college grads, especially white college grads, while the GOP still heavily relies on white voters without degrees, even as their share of college grads grows.
Exactly. And that mix surely affects the kinds of arguments that resonate, the policy priorities, and again, how you build that coalition. And it feeds back into the WAPO point about navigating different kinds of groups.
It really feels like you can't understand the strategic choices, like this focus on civility, without seeing the demographic foundation underneath it all, which Pew lays out so clearly.
I think that's right. The WAPO piece offers a really interesting lens on strategy, and the Pew data provides the factual bedrock showing why those strategies might differ between the parties. It's about the composition of the teams, fundamentally.
The composition shapes the game plan.
You could put it that way, yeah. The Democrats' long-term experience juggling a very diverse set of players versus the Republicans' experience with a less diverse lineup, even as it changes. It just leads down different paths.
So wrapping this up, thinking about all these shifts, the increasing diversity overall, but the different rates and compositions within each party, plus the age and education trends and these contrasting experiences in coalition building, what's the big takeaway?
Well, I think it highlights just how dynamic American politics are right now. The ground really is shifting. Both parties are grappling with an electorate that looks and thinks differently than it did even 10 or 20 years ago.
And they're adapting or trying to adapt in different ways.
Right, the Democratic Big Tent approach has its own challenges and strengths born from its history. The Republican approach, perhaps reflected in this civility focus, also has its own logic and potential pitfalls given their base and history.
So the final question for our listeners to maybe chew on is, given all this, what's next? As the country keeps diversifying, how might these parties continue to evolve their strategies? Will we see more convergence in their approaches, or will they diverge even further?
And how does this play out not just nationally, but in your state, your town? How do these big demographic currents influence the political conversations and choices you see around you?
Definitely a lot to think about there. It goes way beyond just the headlines.
It certainly does.